Thaddeus Sterling signed the divorce papers the way he closed acquisitions. One fluid stroke, no hesitation, eyes already moving to the next item on his mental checklist. The Mont Blanc pen, a gift from the board after Sterling Tech's Series C, caught the late afternoon sun streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows of his Park Avenue office. Beyond the glass, Manhattan glittered like a circuit board, all hard edges and calculated connections. He'd built an empire in this city, clawed his way up from a cramped studio in Alphabet City to this steel and marble throne room where decisions worth billions happened before lunch. The cream envelope sat on polished walnut, innocuous as a dinner invitation. Inside, dissolution. 8 years reduced to legal boilerplate and property schedules. Across the room, Isabeau Voss stood silhouetted against the Hudson River arms, folded, her reflection layered over the water, like she'd already claimed that view as hers. She didn't speak. The CFO of Sterling Tech had learned early that silence carried more weight than reassurance. When Thaddeus was in this mood, the cold executive focus that made venture capitalists nervous and competitors fold. He capped the pen with a soft click that sounded final. "Deliver this tonight." His voice carried no emotion, just instruction. Same tone he used for firing underperformers. "Make sure she gets it by 8. His attorney, a gray-haired man named Whitmore, who'd handled 3 prior dissolutions for tech moguls in this very office, slid the envelope into his briefcase without comment. Professionals didn't judge. They executed. Isabeau turned from the window heels, silent on imported Italian tile. The dying light turned her dark hair copper-cast shadows under cheekbones sharp enough to draw blood. She'd joined Sterling Tech 14 months ago with credentials from Goldman and a reputation for turning distressed assets profitable. What the board hadn't put in her file. How she looked at Thaddeus during strategy meetings, the lingering brush of fingers when passing documents, the calculated vulnerability in late-night work sessions when everyone else had gone home. "Is this really necessary?" Her question landed soft, almost tentative. "The paternity clause, I mean." Thaddeus closed his laptop, the motion definitive. Due diligence. Any competent attorney would recommend the same when there's a prenup and community property at stake. She's 5 months pregnant, which is precisely why we need legal clarity before the birth complicates custody arrangements. Outside, a helicopter carved across the skyline, its navigation lights blinking red against gathering dusk. Thaddeus watched it bank toward the East River, some billionaire's commute from Manhattan to the Hamptons. He'd take that flight himself once this mess was finalized, once Evangeline was settled somewhere with her support payments and her wounded dignity, once Sterling Tech's Q3 earnings call was behind him, and the board stopped asking uncomfortable questions about executive stability. His mind had already moved past the divorce, past the woman who'd shared his bed and his brownstone, and his rare moments of doubt at 3 in the morning when code wouldn't compile and investors were threatening to pull out. Eva had been useful once, her quiet competence, her way of making chaos feel manageable, her uncanny ability to anticipate what he needed before he articulated it. But useful had an expiration date in a world that demanded evolution. "She'll land on her feet." The words came out more defensive than he'd intended. "She always does." What he didn't say, what he'd never admit even to Isabeau, Eva had changed. Pregnancy had made her soft in ways that went beyond the physical. She cried at commercials, asked questions about feelings, wanted to discuss nursery colors when he was trying to review acquisition targets. The woman he'd married at City Hall 8 years ago, sharp-minded, low-maintenance content to let him chase his vision, had dissolved into someone who needed reassurance, craved presence, made him feel guilty for the very drive that built their lifestyle. A billionaire CEO couldn't afford that kind of emotional drag. Not when Apex Ventures was circling Sterling Tech like sharks scenting blood. Not when the trade press was running think pieces about whether his leadership had plateaued. Not when every quarterly call felt like defending territory instead of conquering new ground. Isabeau moved closer, her perfume something French and expensive cutting through the office's air-conditioned neutrality. You could still call it off. Send flowers, couples therapy, public reconciliation. The optics would actually play well, humanize you for the IPO follow-on. He met her eyes, Saw the calculation there, the same strategic thinking that had made her CFO at 32. But beneath it, something else flickered. Want, ambition. The promise that she understood power in ways Eva never had, that she wouldn't ask him to choose between empire and intimacy because she knew there was no choice. It's done. He turned back to the window, effectively dismissing her. Have legal coordinate the penthouse logistics. I want her out in 72 hours. After Isabeau left, after his attorney packed up and murmured something about Monday depositions, Thaddeus stood alone in his office and let himself remember. 8 years dissolved into moments. Eva at the Museum of Modern Art, standing in front of a Rothko canvas, explaining color field theory to a group of tourists who'd wandered into her orbit. She wore a thrift store dress that day, her hair caught up in a clip, no makeup, completely unaware of her effect on the room. He'd been there for a donor event, bored senseless by rubber chicken speeches and forced networking when her voice cut through the noise. You're reading it wrong. She'd said it to a man in a Rolex, polite but firm. Rothko wasn't painting walls of color. He was painting the space between colors, the tension that makes you feel something you can't name. Thaddeus had approached after the tourists dispersed, intrigued despite himself. What do you feel when you look at it? She'd turned those gray-green eyes on him, serious, present, in a way that made everyone else in the gallery fade to background noise. Like I'm standing at the edge of something vast, and I have to decide whether to jump. 3 weeks later, they were engaged. 6 months after that, married at City Hall with 2 witnesses pulled from the street. Eva had laughed when he'd asked if she wanted a big wedding, said she'd rather have him than a production. He'd thought that meant she understood that she valued the same things he did. He'd been wrong. The FedEx courier arrived at the townhouse overlooking Central Park at 7:42 in the evening, 16 minutes ahead of Thaddeus's 8 o'clock deadline. Eva heard the knock while standing barefoot in the kitchen watching a kettle whistle softly on the gas range. Early autumn air drifted through the cracked window, carrying the distant hum of Fifth Avenue traffic and the smell of someone's fireplace, impossibly cozy against the coming October chill. She knew what was in the envelope before she opened the door. Had known for weeks, really, ever since Thaddeus started coming home later smelling of perfume that wasn't hers, looking through her instead of at her. The signs weren't subtle if you bothered to read them, the way he flinched when she touched his shoulder, the careful neutrality in his tone when discussing anything personal, the sudden interest in restructuring their prenuptial agreement for tax purposes. Signature required. The courier avoided eye contact, probably sensed the weight of what he was delivering. Eva signed with a steady hand, her name looking smaller than she remembered on the digital screen. 5 months pregnant, wearing an oversized cashmere sweater that had belonged to her mother, she didn't look like the wife of a billionaire CEO. Tonight she wasn't. Thank you. She closed the door gently, no drama, no trembling hands. The envelope sat on the marble counter beside her MacBook Air for a full minute before she slid it open with a kitchen knife. Inside, pages and pages of legal language that translated to, "You are disposable. Your contributions are unquantifiable. Your future is a liability we're mitigating." Asset disclosures, property transfers, a 72-hour vacate notice for the penthouse. Not this townhouse, which predated the marriage which had been hers all along, though Thaddeus had somehow convinced himself he'd provided it. Temporary spousal support capped at a number that would have insulted her if she didn't understand exactly why it was structured that way. He thought she had nowhere to go. Thought 8 years of supporting his vision, editing his pitch decks at 2 in the morning, selling her mother's jewelry to cover payroll when venture funding fell through, nodding sympathetically through his panic attacks before investor meetings, thought all of that added up to dependency. Then she reached the clause that made her go, still, request for court-ordered paternity verification. The air in the kitchen changed, not rage, not hysteria, something colder, more clarifying, like standing at the edge of something vast and deciding finally to jump. Her hand moved instinctively to her abdomen where the baby shifted a small flutter beneath her palm. She'd felt that first kick 3 weeks ago while Thaddeus was in San Francisco, had texted him a video of her belly moving, had waited for a response that came 6 hours later. Cool. We'll call later. He never called. I know. The words came out as a whisper. I know, sweetheart. Outside the townhouse windows, Manhattan glowed indifferent and eternal. Thaddeus was probably at the plaza right now, shaking hands at some innovation summit, building alliances, rewriting his narrative. The divorce would play as a mutual decision, a mature uncoupling evidence of his ability to make hard choices for the sake of the company. Financial media would frame it as a positive Sterling CEO streamlines personal life ahead of major expansion. What he didn't know, what he'd never bothered to learn in 8 years of marriage, was the trust fund structured 20 years ago under a different last name. The voting shares held in escrow since before they'd met, waiting for her to activate them with a single phone call. The $50 million her father had quietly injected into Sterling Tech's Series B round in 2020, when Thaddeus's startup was 72 hours from bankruptcy, and Eva had begged Cornelius not to let her husband's dream die. Thaddeus believed he'd built his empire alone, believed venture capitalists had seen his genius and opened their wallets out of pure faith. He'd never looked closely at the Series B term sheet, never questioned why Atlas Partners, a fund he'd never heard of before or since, had wired $50 million with minimal due diligence and founder-friendly terms. Eva gathered the divorce papers, neatly slid them back into the envelope, closed her laptop without opening it. Then she reached for her phone. There was only one person she needed to call, and for the first time in 5 years she was ready to use her real name. The chandeliers inside the Plaza Grand Ballroom shimmered like manufactured stars, each crystal worth more than most Americans made in a year. Thaddeus Cross moved through the crowd with practiced ease, one hand resting lightly at the small of Isabeau's back, the other accepting champagne flutes he never intended to drink. Cameras flashed as they entered the annual Innovation and Capital Summit, Manhattan's elite, already gathering in designer armor and corporate war paint. He looked composed, unbothered, victorious. Navy Tom Ford suit, Patek Philippe watch hair, graying at the temples in exactly the way Silicon Alley investors found reassuring. 35 years old, and he'd already built Sterling Tech into a $2.4 billion valuation, created 300 jobs, disrupted an industry that desperately needed disruption. The divorce was a footnote, a private matter. Nothing that would impact shareholder value. Mr. Sterling. A reporter from TechCrunch materialized at his elbow phone, already recording. Congratulations on the Q3 numbers. Quick question about your recent separation. We've chosen different paths. Thaddeus adjusted his cufflinks, the gesture smooth, rehearsed. I wish her well, and I'm grateful for the time we shared. Now, if you'll excuse me, I see the senator. Isabeau's red Dior gown caught the light as she tilted her head closer to him. A silent reinforcement of the image he wanted the world to see. Strength, progress forward, motion, no vulnerability. Inside, though, something flickered. Not guilt. Thaddeus had made peace with the divorce as a necessary strategic pivot, but irritation. The timing wasn't ideal. SEC inquiry rumors had already stirred unease in the market, whispers about insider trading patterns around Sterling Tech's last acquisition. Personal headlines were a distraction when he needed analysts focused on the upcoming product launch, when Apex Ventures was making noise about hostile positioning, when the board was already questioning whether his leadership had the maturity to scale into the next phase. Across the ballroom, executives whispered behind champagne flutes. Investors observed with the cold calculation of people measuring risk against return. Thaddeus felt their eyes measuring him, recalculating his value based on variables that had nothing to do with code or vision or market share. He lifted a glass of Moet, the gesture expansive, confident. To growth, he announced to the small circle forming around him. To knowing when to shed what no longer serves the mission. They laughed, clinked glasses, nodded along. But beneath the social choreography, Thaddeus registered the slight hesitation, the way conversations paused when he approached the careful neutrality in voices that last quarter had been effusive. At that same moment, 15 blocks south in a quieter corner of Manhattan, Eva sat alone in the townhouse library. A single lamp illuminated leather-bound spines that had belonged to her mother, Her grandmother, 3 generations of Hartwell women who'd understood that quiet accumulation of power trumped loud displays every time. Her phone buzzed again and again with news alerts. Sterling Tech CEO appears solo at gala. Insiders confirm divorce filing. Pregnant wife absent from public events. She didn't open the articles, didn't need to. The narrative would write itself. Ambitious man outgrows starter wife, trades up for someone who matched his evolved status. The comments section would split between calling her a gold digger who lost the meal ticket and pitying her as a victim of male narcissism. Nobody would guess the truth, which was so much more interesting than either story. Instead, Eva opened her laptop, typed a password she hadn't used in 5 years, Hartwell 2020. The Caldwell Sovereign Capital portal loaded slowly, layers of authentication confirming her identity through biometrics and encrypted keys that would take a quantum computer decades to crack. Numbers filled the screen. Ownership percentages, voting blocks, strategic leverage carefully accumulated over 2 decades of quiet acquisition. Downtown Thaddeus believed he was shaping the narrative, controlling the optics, managing the fallout. But the market didn't care about narratives. It cared about control, and control Eva was about to demonstrate had never actually been his. Back at the plaza, Isabeau leaned close to Thaddeus's ear, her breath warm against his neck. Everything is moving faster than expected. The whisper carried urgency beneath its studied calm. He smiled faintly, nodded to a passing venture capitalist. Good. What he didn't realize was that the speed wasn't in his favor. Somewhere between the champagne toasts and the flash of cameras and the congratulatory shoulder claps from men who'd sell him out the moment it benefited their portfolios, the foundation beneath his empire had already begun to shift. The Hamptons were quieter. In autumn, summer people fled back to the city, leaving the oceanfront estates to their skeleton crews and the gulls. Cornelius Hartwell stood alone on the terrace of his Bridgehampton compound, the Atlantic stretching endlessly beyond manicured hedges and limestone balustrades that had witnessed a century of family gatherings. The wind carried salt and distance and the particular loneliness of old money, watching new money repeat its mistakes. In his hand rested an iPad displaying a live ticker, Sterling Tech, fluctuating in narrow, anxious increments. Down 3.8% since market open, trading volume elevated, institutional funds rebalancing their positions. To most analysts, this registered as normal volatility around an executive's personal news. To Cornelius, who'd spent 40 years reading market psychology like other men read novels, it smelled like blood in the water. His phone buzzed once. Eva. He didn't answer immediately. Inside the house was museum quiet. No staff hovered in doorways, no assistants materialized with updates. Cornelius preferred silence when markets shifted, when the careful architectures of power revealed their stress fractures. He walked back through French doors into a study lined with photographs that told the story of American capital himself, with 3 presidents, handwritten notes from Fed chairmen, architectural renderings of projects his money had financed from Dubai to Sao Paulo. Hartwell Capital never sought headlines, never gave interviews to financial press, never appeared on CNBC to predict market movements. The family had learned 2 centuries ago that leverage worked best in shadow, that the real players never stepped into spotlights. The phone buzzed again. This time he accepted the call. So, his voice carried no warmth, no judgment, just the clinical assessment of a surgeon examining an X-ray. Are you ready? Across the line. Eva's response came steady as a metronome. No tremor, no tears, just the same calm she'd inherited from her mother, who'd inherited it from her mother before that. Women who understood that emotion was fuel, not weakness, and the trick was burning it at the temperature you chose. He requested a paternity test. Cornelius's jaw tightened, the only visible crack in 72 years of practiced composure. His fingers went white around the iPad's edge, and the apartment 72 hours to vacate. Silence settled between them, not awkward but strategic, the kind of pause that happened in negotiations when both parties were calculating 12 moves ahead. 5 years ago, Eva had rejected her inheritance, walked away from the Hartwell name and its crushing weight of expectation. She'd wanted a marriage built on equality, not advantage. Cornelius had warned her then, sitting in this very study, while October light died over the Atlantic. Powerful men often love what they believe they control. The moment you threaten that belief, you'll see who he really is. Now the lesson had come due. I won't step in publicly. His voice carried the weight of experience of watching this pattern repeat across generations. Not yet. The board needs to make their own assessments. The market needs to react organically. If I intervene now, it looks like Daddy's money-solving problems. I'm not asking you to. Eva's answer shifted something in Cornelius's chest, something that felt dangerously close to pride. Outside the study windows, waves crashed steadily against Private Beach. Markets were built on perception. Cornelius had taught Eva since she was old enough to understand compound interest. But control was built on timing. You didn't move until your opponent was committed to a position they couldn't reverse. Sterling Tech's voting structure appeared airtight on paper. Thaddeus Cross held 41% of voting shares, enough for effective control when combined with friendly board members and institutional investors who preferred stable leadership. But appearances like Thaddeus's self-made mythology dissolved under scrutiny. Hartwell Capital held layered instruments accumulated slowly over 5 years. Convertible notes from that Series B round in 2020, silent equity purchases through shell companies with names like Atlas Partners and Sentinel Holdings, escrow shares that had sat dormant since Eva's 21st birthday, waiting for activation. Waiting for this exact moment. You understand what this triggers. Cornelius walked to the window, watched a sailboat cut across distant swells. Board review. Emergency shareholder meeting. Media scrutiny. A war without noise. Yes. One word, but it carried everything. Determination, calculation, the steel-spined resolve of someone who'd decided mercy was overrated when dealing with cruelty. In Manhattan, Thaddeus was likely celebrating momentum, toasting his liberation, planning his next acquisition, while Isabeau whispered strategies in his ear. He'd miscalculated Eva as collateral damage, a loose end to tie off before moving forward. What he didn't understand, what his particular brand of narcissism made invisible, was that underestimating the quiet ones was how empires fell. Cornelius opened a secure email thread marked Contingency Protocol Alpha. The recipients, his general counsel, his chief investment officer, the 3 board members of Sterling Tech, who technically reported to institutional investors but understood where their real loyalty belonged. He typed only 2 words: proceed quietly. And for the first time since his daughter had called him 5 years ago to say she was marrying a nobody from Brooklyn with a coding degree and a dream, Cornelius Hartwell felt something unexpected. Not anger, not regret. Pride. Monday morning opened red. Thaddeus stood in his corner office before markets fully stabilized, watching Sterling Tech dip 4.2% within the first hour of trading. The numbers scrolled across his Bloomberg terminal in sharp, unforgiving lines of white and crimson, each tick downward representing millions in market cap evaporating like morning fog. It wasn't catastrophic. He'd weathered worse volatility during acquisition cycles, during product launch stumbles, during that nightmare week in 2021 when a zero-day exploit had exposed customer data and sent the stock into freefall. But this felt different, sharper, more personal. Investor jitters. Isabeau's voice came smooth from the conference table where she'd set up her MacBook and pulled up institutional trading patterns. The divorce headline spooked a few funds. It'll correct by lunch. Thaddeus didn't respond immediately. His reflection in the floor-to-ceiling glass looked steady. Pressed white shirt, navy slacks, the uniform of competence, but his jaw had gone tight. Who's selling? Nothing major. She scrolled through data, fingers moving with the efficiency that had made her CFO. Retail volume, some minor rebalancing from Vanguard and Fidelity. Standard stuff when there's executive news. Standard. Yet someone was buying. Not aggressive enough to trigger SEC disclosure requirements, not concentrated enough to raise red flags, but steady. Disciplined. Precise enough to matter. Pull the ownership breakdown. The order came out harder than intended. Within seconds, charts populated his monitor. Layered entities, shell funds, proxy holdings. Clean. Almost too clean. The kind of structure that suggested serious money moving with serious intent. Have legal flag any new voting blocks above 2%. He turned from the window, forced his shoulders to relax. And get me updated short interest data. If someone's playing games, I want to know who. Isabeau hesitated, barely noticeable, then nodded. Already in motion. By noon, the drop stabilized at 3.9%. Financial news outlets framed it as temporary turbulence. Analysts reassured viewers that Sterling Tech's fundamentals remained strong, that executive personal matters rarely translated to lasting valuation damage. But fundamentals weren't what bothered Thaddeus. Control did. His assistant entered quietly, a woman in her 50s who'd survived 3 regime changes by perfecting invisibility. "Sir, we've received a formal inquiry from a shareholder group requesting a governance review." He turned slowly from the terminal. "What group?" She glanced down at her tablet, and something in her hesitation made Thaddeus's pulse spike. Hartwell Capital. For the first time that day, for the first time since signing divorce papers with such confidence, Thaddeus Cross felt something unfamiliar crawl up his spine. Not panic, not yet, but pressure. The kind that built silently beneath foundations long before buildings cracked. The Yale Club occupied a limestone fortress on Vanderbilt Avenue, all dark wood paneling and oil portraits of men who'd shaped American industry when industry meant steel and railroads instead of algorithms. Thaddeus arrived 15 minutes early, a calculated move designed to claim territory to frame the meeting on his terms. The maitre d' led him through the dining room to a private corner booth where light fell in controlled slabs through leaded windows illuminating silverware that weighed heavy as weapons. Cornelius Hartwell was already seated. That detail alone, that the old man had arrived first, claimed the power position facing the door, ordered what looked like a 20-year Macallan without waiting, set Thaddeus's teeth on edge. He'd researched Eva's father obsessively over the past 72 hours, pulling every article, every SEC filing, every mention in the financial press. What emerged was more absence than presence, a ghost who moved markets without interviews, who'd turned a modest inheritance into a multi-billion-dollar empire through acquisitions so quiet most people didn't know his name. "Mr. Hartwell." Thaddeus extended his hand across mahogany that had probably witnessed a century of power negotiations. The older man's grip was brief, dry, utterly without warmth. "Mr. Sterling." "Sit." Not an invitation, a command. Thaddeus sat, fighting the impulse to match Cornelius's neutral expression with aggression. This wasn't a boardroom where youth and innovation carried advantage. This was old money's territory, where patience had compounded across generations until it became its own form of violence. A waiter materialized, poured water into crystal that probably cost more than the divorce settlement Thaddeus had offered Eva. He ordered coffee, black, needing the bitterness. "I assume this isn't a social call." Better to strike first, establish that he wasn't intimidated. Cornelius studied him with eyes the same gray-green as his daughter's, though where Eva's had held warmth even in anger, her father's carried the temperature of actuarial tables. "My daughter has endured public humiliation." Thaddeus kept his voice level, reasonable. "Your daughter and I are resolving a private matter through proper legal channels. The public aspect is unavoidable given my position, but I've instructed my team to keep statements minimal. You requested a paternity test." The words landed like cards turned face up in poker, revealing exactly what Cornelius thought of that move. Heat crawled up Thaddeus's neck, but he held the older man's gaze. "That's standard practice in high-asset divorces. My attorneys recommended your attorneys work for you." The interruption was surgical precise, which means you made a choice to publicly question whether your pregnant wife committed adultery. Not your lawyers, you. Outside the windows, Midtown Manhattan churned through its Monday afternoon, oblivious to the quiet demolition happening in this leather booth. Thaddeus felt his carefully prepared arguments dissolving like sugar in acid. He'd expected anger threats, maybe even an offer to buy him out. Not this clinical dissection of character. "I'm protecting shareholder interests." He heard the defensiveness in his own voice, hated it. Any future financial obligations need legal clarity. That's responsible corporate governance. Cornelius leaned back, his Brioni suit sitting on his frame, the way clothes sat on men who'd never had to think about what they cost. Is that what you call it? Responsible governance? The question hung there, rhetorical and damning. Let me tell you about responsible governance, Thaddeus. Cornelius lifted his. Macallan didn't drink, just let the amber liquid catch light while Thaddeus's pulse hammered in his throat. 5 years ago, you were 72 hours from bankruptcy. Do you remember that week? The question punched through Thaddeus's defenses like a blade between ribs. He remembered God. He remembered every excruciating hour of October 2020 when Sterling Tech's Series A funding had evaporated after their lead investor got cold feet when payroll was coming due, and he had 16 employees counting on him when Eva was 3 months pregnant with their first child, and he was lying awake calculating which possessions he could sell to cover 1 more month of server costs. I remember we secured Series B funding. His voice came out tight, controlled. Atlas Partners came through with $50 million when everyone else passed. Cornelius set down his glass with a soft click that sounded like a gavel. Atlas Partners is a subsidiary of Sentinel Holdings. Sentinel Holdings is a shell company registered in Delaware. The ultimate beneficial owner is Hartwell Capital. The words took a moment to penetrate like bullets that didn't hurt until you looked down and saw blood spreading across your shirt. Thaddeus's vision tunneled the dining room, receding until all he could see was Cornelius's face, impassive as a hanging judge. That's not... His throat closed around the denial. I vetted that funding. I saw the term sheet, the due diligence reports, the partnership agreements. Atlas was a venture fund out of Boston. Atlas was whatever paperwork I instructed my attorneys to prepare. Cornelius finally sipped his whiskey, savoring it like the moment. Your vetting consisted of a 23-year-old associate doing Google searches and checking a corporate registry that showed exactly what I wanted it to show. Thaddeus's hands had gone numb. $50 million. The foundation of everything Sterling Tech had become the Series C that followed the product launches, the acquisitions, the IPO that made him a billionaire before 35. All of it built on capital he thought came from strangers who believed in his vision. Why? The words scraped out. Why would you? Because my daughter loved you. Cornelius's voice didn't rise, didn't need to. Because Eva came to me in tears, begging me not to let her husband's dream die, promising she'd never tell you, because she knew you'd refuse help from her family. Because I looked at this terrified pregnant woman who'd sold her mother's jewelry to make your last payroll, and I thought maybe this punk from Brooklyn will prove worthy of that kind of loyalty. Each word landed like a hammer on a nail already driven deep. Thaddeus thought about the day that Atlas funding hit his bank account, how he'd literally jumped in the air, how he'd taken Eva to Lombardi's Pizza in Little Italy, not Per Se or 11 Madison Park. They couldn't afford that yet, and told her he'd done it. He'd saved the company. He'd proved everyone wrong who said a kid from a rent-controlled apartment couldn't compete with Harvard MBAs and trust fund founders. She'd smiled, raised her Diet Coke in a toast. I never doubted you. And he'd believed her praise was about his achievement, not her sacrifice. You lied to me. The accusation came out weak, grasping. I protected your ego. Cornelius signaled for the check, the meeting clearly over in his mind. Eva protected your dream. And you protected nothing but your own mythology. Thaddeus wanted to argue, to defend himself, to explain that he'd worked 100-hour weeks, that he'd built genuine value, that the coding and the vision and the execution were all his. But the foundation had cracked, and everything built on it suddenly felt unstable, fraudulent, hollow. The older man stood buttoning his suit jacket with the casual precision of someone who'd never rushed a movement in 72 years. One more thing, Thaddeus. That prenuptial agreement you're hiding behind, Eva signed it before our family attorneys reviewed it because she trusted you. That trust was a gift, and gifts once broken don't get replaced. He walked out without another word, leaving Thaddeus alone with a check he couldn't bring himself to pick up and a reality he couldn't bring himself to face. The penthouse felt enormous and empty in ways that had nothing to do with square footage. Thaddeus stood in the living room, 30-foot ceilings, walls of glass, overlooking Central Park furniture that had been featured in Architectural Digest, and saw it all as set dressing for a performance that had closed without applause. Eva's absence carved holes in space. The corner where she'd curled up reading backlit by sunset. The kitchen island where she'd left sticky notes with terrible puns designed to make him smile during all-nighters. The bedroom where he'd last seen her 5 days ago when he'd told her his attorney would be in touch, and she'd just nodded. No tears, no begging, just a quiet, "I understand." He'd thought her silence meant acceptance. Realized now it meant she'd already moved 3 steps ahead while he was still counting his own pieces. His laptop sat open on the dining table, cursor blinking in a search bar. He'd been avoiding this for hours, maybe longer, but Cornelius's revelation had stripped away the last excuse. He typed Evangeline Marie Hartwell. The results loaded like an indictment. Wall Street Journal, April 2018. Hartwell heiress renounces trust, seeks authentic life. The photo showed Eva at 23 standing outside what the caption identified as the Hartwell Capital headquarters in Lower Manhattan. She wore a simple black dress, no jewelry except that locket. She'd never explained her expression serious as she faced a small crowd of financial reporters. When asked about walking away from an estimated $2.1 billion inheritance, Ms. Hartwell stated, "I want to build something myself with someone who sees me as a person, not a portfolio. My family's legacy is extraordinary, but it's not mine. Not yet. Maybe never." Thaddeus clicked through to Vanity Fair, March 2017, The Heiress Who Disappeared. This piece went deeper, tracing Eva's departure from Manhattan society after graduating Columbia. Photos showed her at galas and charity auctions, always slightly apart from the crowd, always looking at something beyond the frame. Friends describe Evangeline as intellectually brilliant but socially uncomfortable with the performance aspects of wealth. She'd rather discuss Rothko's color theory than her trust fund, says classmate Jennifer Morrison. When she stopped showing up to events, nobody was surprised. Eva never fit that world, even though she was born into it. Another photo, this one from her 21st birthday party at some estate in Connecticut. Eva in a white gown, Cornelius's hand on her shoulder, both of them looking stiff and formal for the camera. She'd told Thaddeus her parents were dead. Not technically a lie, her mother had died when Eva was 17, but a lie by omission, massive enough to reframe their entire relationship. He found their wedding announcement buried in the New York Times archives, a 3-line mention he'd never bothered to read. Evangeline Marie Hartwell, daughter of financier Cornelius Hartwell, married Thaddeus Sterling in a private ceremony at Manhattan City Hall. Her real name, right there. And he'd glanced at the marriage certificate, seen Evangeline M. Hartwell, made that stupid joke about the M standing for millionaire, and she'd smiled that sad smile and said something like that. And he'd been too wrapped up in his own stress about the startup's Series A pitch to actually hear what she was telling him. Thaddeus opened his banking records, started tracing the money backwards. Atlas Partners had wired $50 million into Sterling Tech's operating account on October 15, 2020. That same day, he'd sent an email to his investors and board members, subject line, "We did it." He'd written, "This investment validates everything I've built alone. It proves that talent and vision matter more than connections or pedigree. Sterling Tech succeeded because of the work, not because of who I know or where I came from." The word "alone" sat on his screen now like evidence at a murder trial. He'd sent that email from the cramped studio apartment in Alphabet City where Eva was sleeping on their second-hand couch because pregnancy exhaustion hit her every afternoon. He remembered feeling so proud, so vindicated, like he'd finally escaped the gravity of his own background. The rent-controlled apartment in Sunset Park, the father who drove a taxi, the mother who cleaned offices at night to pay for his coding boot camp. Eva had woken up when he'd whooped, had come over to read the email over his shoulder. Her arms had circled his waist from behind her chin, resting on his shoulder. "I'm so proud of you." Her voice had been soft, genuine. "You never gave up." He'd turned, kissed her, started talking about moving out of the studio, getting a proper office space, hiring the engineers he'd been courting, plans tumbling out like water from a broken dam. And she'd listened, nodded, smiled, never once mentioned that her father had just saved them with her trust fund money that she'd supposedly renounced, because she'd wanted him to feel like he'd earned it, because she'd loved him enough to let him have his mythology intact. Thaddeus closed the laptop, walked to the window. Central Park stretched below a dark geometric void in the city's grid of light. Somewhere down there, Eva was sleeping in a townhouse he'd assumed was a rental, carrying his son, planning something he couldn't see yet but could feel circling like weather. His phone buzzed. Text from Isabeau, board meeting scheduled for tomorrow 8 a.m. Hartwell Capital formally requested governance review, need to prep talking points. He didn't respond. Instead, he opened his phone's camera roll, scrolled back through years of photos. Found one from their wedding day City Hall steps, Eva in a simple cream dress from Bergdorf's sale rack, him in the only suit he owned at the time. They looked impossibly young, impossibly hopeful. Her smile was real in that photo. He remembered because he'd made her laugh right before the shutter clicked something stupid about how they'd beaten the odds just by finding each other in a city of 8 million people. When had that smile disappeared? When had the woman who laughed at his terrible jokes turned into the quiet, withdrawn presence he'd found so inconvenient during board dinners? He scrolled forward, found photos from the IPO celebration at the plaza where Eva sat at their table in a black gown, makeup perfect expression, carefully neutral while he worked the room. Found photos from product launches where she stood just outside the frame, always present, never centered. Found the last photo he'd taken of her 3 months ago at a benefit dinner. She was looking away from the camera, one hand on her barely visible pregnancy bump face, turned toward some distant point he hadn't bothered to identify. She'd been leaving him for months, maybe years. Just slowly enough that he hadn't noticed until the door was already closed. Tuesday morning brought the kind of October weather that made Manhattan feel like the center of the universe. Crisp air, blue sky, sunlight, turning glass towers into monuments to ambition. Thaddeus arrived at Sterling Tech headquarters at 7:30, needing the extra time to armor up mentally for what was coming. The boardroom occupied the 42nd floor, floor-to-ceiling windows offering 360 views of a city that looked conquerable from this height. 16 leather chairs circled a table made from a single slab of walnut, each seat representing millions in capital and decades of combined expertise. These were people who'd backed Thaddeus through 3 funding rounds and IPO2 acquisitions, people who'd made fortunes betting on his vision. Today they looked at him like a risk that needed reassessing. Legal counsel opened the presentation, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone delivering bad news to powerful people. As of market close yesterday, Hartwell Capital has formally converted certain escrow instruments into voting shares. Combined with their existing position, they now control 39.1% of Sterling Tech's voting rights. Numbers appeared on the screen color-coded in ways that made Thaddeus's 41% look less secure than it had last week. Murmurs rippled around the table. This is coordinated. The observation came from Mitchell Raines, a board member who'd made his fortune in telecom before retiring to play power broker. You don't move that much equity without a strategy. Legal counsel clicked to the next slide. Additionally, we've identified a secondary accumulation by an entity called Apex Ventures. They've disclosed an 8.4% position as of this morning, bringing their stake above the threshold requiring public notification. Thaddeus felt the room's temperature drop. Apex wasn't passive capital. They were vultures who specialized in distressed companies forcing board changes, stripping assets, maximizing short-term returns while burning long-term value. Last year, they'd acquired 12% of a biotech firm, replaced the CEO, sold off the research division to pay themselves a special dividend, then flipped their stake at a profit while employees lost their jobs. That's a coincidence. Isabeau's voice cut through the tension smooth as silk over steel. 2 separate entities making independent decisions based on market conditions. Is it? Another board member. Patricia Joe from Sequoia leaned forward. Hartwell activates voting rights the same week Apex crosses the disclosure threshold. That's either the unluckiest timing in finance or someone's coordinating. We have no evidence of collusion. Isabeau pulled up a counter-presentation charts showing Sterling Tech's strong fundamentals, growth projections, competitive advantages. This is noise around a personal matter that has zero impact on operations. Thaddeus watched her work. The room felt grateful for her competence, even as something nagged at the edge of his awareness. Isabeau had joined Sterling Tech 14 months ago, recommended by a headhunter he'd trusted. She'd restructured their debt, optimized their tax position, negotiated favorable terms on their last acquisition. Everything above board, everything brilliant. But that second phone he'd glimpsed on her desk last week, the one she'd turned face down when he'd entered her office. The encrypted messaging app she'd minimized during a screen share. Details he'd dismissed as CFO paranoia about security suddenly felt more significant. The chairman cleared his throat, bringing the room to attention. Given the current shareholder composition and recent volatility, I'm calling for a vote. Temporary governance review, effective immediately to assess executive decision-making and fiduciary responsibility during this transition period. The words landed like a guillotine blade. Thaddeus opened his mouth to object, but Patricia Joe was already nodding. Mitchell Raines seconded the motion. One by one, hands rose around the table. 7 in favor, 2 opposed, 1 abstention. The gavel came down at 9:47 on a Tuesday morning, and Thaddeus Sterling lost operational control of the company he'd founded in a studio apartment 8 years ago with nothing but code and conviction. He walked out of that boardroom in a daze, Isabeau falling in step beside him. "This is temporary." Her hand brushed his arm, reassuring, intimate. "We weather this, let the volatility settle, then reverse the decision once cooler heads prevail." Something in her tone, too smooth, too prepared, made him stop. "How did you know? Know what that apex would disclose today? That Hartwell would move yesterday? You had those counter charts ready before legal even started presenting." She held his gaze, didn't flinch. "I'm good at my job, Thaddeus. That means anticipating scenarios and preparing responses. Would you prefer a CFO who gets surprised by SEC filings? No. But he'd prefer a CFO whose explanations didn't feel rehearsed." His phone buzzed. Email from an address he didn't recognize, subject line, "You should see this." He almost deleted it as spam, but something, instinct, paranoia, desperation, made him open it. Inside, a PDF of Isabeau's personal trading records from the past 6 months. Sterling Tech stock sales, perfectly timed to market peaks, executed through a Cayman Islands account that technically complied with insider trading rules, but screamed guilty conscience. 14,000 shares sold over 4 months, generating $3.2 million in personal profit. And one transaction that made his blood freeze, October 8th, 3 days before he'd filed divorce papers, Isabeau had liquidated her entire Sterling Tech position. Every share. Like someone who knew bad news was coming and wanted out before the market caught up. "Where did you get this?" Isabeau's voice had lost its smoothness, gone sharp and dangerous. Thaddeus looked up from his phone, studied the woman he'd been sleeping with for 9 months, the woman he'd planned a future with once Eva was out of the picture. "Does it matter? Is it accurate?" Her silence was confirmation enough. "You sold before the divorce announcement." The realization built like pressure behind his eyes. "You knew I was filing, knew it would tank the stock, and you dumped your position to protect yourself. That's called risk management." But her face had gone pale beneath expensive foundation. "I'm CFO Thaddeus. I have to model all scenarios, including personal disruptions to executive stability. That's literally my job. Your job is fiduciary responsibility to shareholders, not insider trading to line your own pockets. I didn't break any laws." The defensiveness in her voice said otherwise. "Those trades were reported approved by compliance, executed through proper channels." "But you didn't tell me. Didn't warn the board that you were exiting a position because you anticipated my personal life would crater our valuation." Outside his office windows, Manhattan hummed along, indifferent to his implosion. Thaddeus thought about the last 9 months, the late-night strategy sessions that became something else, the weekend trips to the Hamptons, the careful way Isabeau had positioned herself as the antidote to Eva's emotional softness. He'd thought he was making a choice based on compatibility, on finding someone who matched his ambition and understood the sacrifices required for success. Now he saw it differently, a CFO climbing a ladder and cutting rungs below her as insurance. "Get out." The words came out flat, final. "Thaddeus, be reasonable. Get out of my office. Get out of this building. Legal will contact you about the suspension pending board review. You can't fire me." But uncertainty flickered in her eyes. "I report to the board, not to you. Then let the board decide. But until they do, you're suspended from access to financial systems, executive meetings, and confidential information. Security will escort you out." He picked up his desk phone, dialed extension 4400. "This is Sterling. Please send security to my office to escort CFO Voss from the building. Effective immediately." Isabeau stared at him like he'd grown a second head. "You're making a massive mistake. Apex will eat you alive without someone who knows how to play defense." "Funny." Thaddeus set down the phone with a gentleness that belied the rage building in his chest. "I thought you were on my team. Turns out you were playing your own game all along." Security arrived, 2 men in Sterling Tech polos who looked uncomfortable but professional. Isabeau gathered her phone and purse with shaking hands, the calculation finally cracking into something raw. "You're going to regret this." "Maybe." He turned back to the window, dismissing her with his posture. "But at least I won't wonder whose side you're really on." When the office door closed behind her, Thaddeus sank into his chair and let his head fall back against leather. The ceiling was coffered mahogany, installed during the renovation he'd overseen when Sterling Tech moved into this building 3 years ago. He'd stood in this exact spot, watching contractors work, feeling like a king surveying his kingdom. Now the kingdom was crumbling, and he couldn't identify all the enemies at the gate. His phone buzzed again. Different anonymous sender, same kind of message that felt like a gift from someone who wanted him to know the truth. This email contained a single PDF medical records from Mount Sinai Hospital. Date October 22, 2025. Patient, Evangeline M. Sterling. Procedure: emergency cesarean section at 31 weeks gestation due to severe preeclampsia. Outcome: healthy male infant, 6 pounds 2 ounces. APGAR scores 8 and 9. Mother stable post-surgery. Below that, in clinical language that somehow made it more devastating, patient delivered alone. Father contacted but declined to attend. Patient's emergency contact listed as Cornelius Hartwell. Thaddeus's vision blurred. Eva had gone into labor 5 days ago, the same day he'd been at the plaza with Isabeau, toasting his liberation networking with investors, playing the role of unburdened CEO, ready to scale new heights. While he was shaking hands and making deals, Eva had been rushed into surgery at 7 months pregnant, scared and alone, delivering their son without him. Because the hospital had called. He checked his phone log, scrolled back. There it was, Mount Sinai. October 22, 6:47 p.m. He'd seen the notification during the cocktail hour, dismissed it as spam or a wrong number because Eva wasn't due until January, and surely if something was wrong, someone had. He'd ignored it. The medical records included a photo standard hospital documentation. Nathaniel Hartwell. Sterling. His name rendered in careful cursive beneath a red, wrinkled face and eyes scrunched shut against lights too bright for a premature infant. His son. Unmistakably his, with that same stubborn chin, those same deep-set eyes that looked back at him from the mirror every morning. And Thaddeus hadn't been there. He'd requested a paternity test because some paranoid corner of his brain, poisoned by ego and insecurity, had whispered that Eva must have betrayed him, that a woman who'd grown distant during pregnancy, who'd stopped laughing at his jokes and started crying at commercials, must be covering something up. So he'd added that clause to the divorce papers, let his attorneys justify it as standard practice, convinced himself it was about protecting his interests. In reality, he'd been protecting himself from a truth more terrifying than infidelity, that Eva was withdrawing not because she was guilty, but because she'd finally seen him clearly and found him wanting. A knock on his door. Gideon Alcott entered without waiting for invitation, his presence somehow both apologetic and implacable. The attorney carried a manila envelope, set it on Thaddeus's desk with the care of someone handling a live grenade. Paternity results expedited per the court order you requested. Thaddeus didn't reach for it immediately. What if you already know what it says I do? Gideon's expression gave away nothing. But you requested verification through proper channels, so here it is. Certified by 2 independent laboratories, notarized admissible in court. Thaddeus opened the envelope, scrolled past legal disclaimers and methodology descriptions to the conclusion section where numbers rendered in bold delivered their verdict. Probability of paternity, 99.97%. Thaddeus Cross cannot be excluded as the biological father of Nathaniel Hartwell Sterling. His hands were shaking. He set down the report before he could drop it, pressed his palms flat against walnut until the trembling stopped. She never cheated. The words came out hoarse. I accused her of God. I made it public, put it in court filings, let the tabloids speculate about infidelity, and she never— No. Gideon remained standing formal as a pallbearer. She didn't. But you did. The accusation landed clean. Thaddeus looked up, found no sympathy in the attorney's face. Just assessment. There's a note included from Ms. Sterling. Gideon produced a smaller envelope, cream-colored Eva's handwriting, rendering Thaddeus's name in elegant script that somehow made the whole thing worse. She asked me to deliver it after you reviewed the results. Thaddeus took the envelope with numb fingers, waited until Gideon left before opening it. Inside a single card with her monogram, Not Sterling, he realized now, but the intertwined H and M that stood for Hartwell and Marie, her mother's name. Her real identity hidden in plain sight for 8 years. The message was brief. Thaddeus, I never doubted he was yours. I doubted you wanted to be his father. Turns out I was right. E.P.S. You asked for 72 hours to vacate. I've been gone for 5 days. The penthouse is all yours. He read it twice, 3 times, looking for anger or accusation, and finding only exhausted clarity. Eva wasn't fighting him. She was done. His phone buzzed again. Text from an unknown number. Shareholder meeting scheduled 10 a.m. Thursday. Evangeline Hartwell will address the board regarding governance and leadership stability. Press will be present. Thaddeus stared at that message, at Eva's formal name rendered in pixels, and felt the architecture of his life finish its collapse. She wasn't just leaving him. She was taking the company. And based on the math he'd seen this morning, Hartwell Capital's 39%, Apex's 8.4%, the possibility of proxy fights and debt recalls and strategic alliances, he couldn't see yet she might actually succeed. He'd thought signing divorce papers would free him. Instead, he'd triggered a demolition he was only beginning to understand. Outside his windows, the city glittered with indifferent beauty, millions of people pursuing their own ambitions, building their own empires, making their own catastrophic mistakes. Somewhere down there, Eva was preparing to stand up in front of shareholders and financial press and explain exactly why Thaddeus Sterling's judgment could no longer be trusted. And the worst part, the part that made his chest tighten until breathing hurt, was that she'd be right. Thursday morning arrived with the kind of crystalline clarity that made lies impossible to hide. Thaddeus stood in front of his bathroom mirror at 6 a.m., razor in hand, watching his own reflection like it belonged to a stranger. 2 days since the board suspension. 48 hours of insomnia and discovery of anonymous emails arriving like depth charges, each one revealing another layer of his own willful blindness. The anonymous sender he'd stopped trying to identify them had provided a gift last night, Isabeau's phone records from the past 6 months. Not the official Sterling tech device, but her personal iPhone subpoenaed somehow and forwarded to him with surgical precision. The call logs told a story his ego had refused to read: 97 conversations with a number registered to Apex Ventures' New York office. Messages sent at 11 p.m. at 2 a.m. timestamps that overlapped with nights she'd been in his bed whispering strategies and reassurances while building her exit ramp. He'd called her after midnight, demanded answers. She'd hung up. Called back from her attorney's office an hour later with a statement that amounted to prove it. The razor scraped against 3 days of stubble. In the mirror, he looked older than 35, lines carved deep around eyes that hadn't seen real sleep since Eva left. The penthouse behind him stretched vast and accusatory, every empty room a monument to priorities he couldn't defend anymore. His phone buzzed. Text from legal, meeting at 9 a.m. before shareholder session. Strategic prep, mandatory attendance. Strategic prep for his own execution. The irony tasted like copper. Sterling Tech's main conference hall occupied the ground floor designed during the headquarters build-out to accommodate product launches and investor presentations. 200 seats upholstered in charcoal, a stage with podium and screen lighting, sophisticated enough to make average speakers look compelling. Thaddeus had stood on that stage dozens of times announcing acquisitions and innovations and quarterly earnings that beat expectations. Today he entered through the side door like a defendant arriving at trial. The room was already filling. Shareholders in business, casual financial journalists with recording equipment, analysts from Goldman and Morgan Stanley with tablets and that particular brand of polite skepticism that preceded downgrades. Bloomberg had a camera crew setting up in back. This wasn't going to be a quiet restructuring. This was public theater, and someone had sent out invitations. Thaddeus took a seat in the third row, not front where the CEO traditionally sat, not back where he could hide. Middle ground felt like the only honest choice for a man who'd lost the right to control the narrative. The board members filed in, took positions at a table on stage left. Mitchell, Raines, Patricia, Joe, 5 others who'd backed him through years of growth, and now regarded him with the warmth of creditors assessing collateral. Legal counsel sat beside them, manila folders stacked with precision. Then Eva entered, and the room went silent in a way that had nothing to do with respect for authority and everything to do with raw human curiosity about what came next. She wore no power suit, no armor of corporate femininity designed to compete in male spaces. Just a simple cashmere cardigan, the color of fog. Dark jeans, hair pulled back in a low ponytail that emphasized the exhaustion bruised beneath her eyes. She carried a leather portfolio and an infant car seat inside which Nathaniel slept with the profound unconsciousness of the very new. A woman Thaddeus recognized as Eva's former assistant from their married life. Maria, he thought, feeling ashamed. He couldn't remember her last name, hovered nearby, ready to take the baby, but not intrusive. Eva walked to the podium, set down her portfolio, adjusted the microphone with steady hands. No notes, he realized. She was going to speak from memory or from truth deep enough it didn't need scripting. "Good morning." Her voice carried across the room, not loud, but clear, the same tone she'd used when they first met, and she'd explained Rothko to strangers. "Thank you for coming on short notice. My name is Evangeline Hartwell. Some of you know me as Thaddeus Sterling's ex-wife. Others know me as interim chairwoman appointed by majority shareholders. Today I'm here as both and as something else, the mother of a 3-week-old son who deserves a father worthy of the title." She paused. Let that land. Journalists leaned forward. Cameras focused. "But this meeting isn't about my marriage. It's about Sterling Tech and whether this company's leadership has maintained the fiduciary responsibility you deserve as investors." The screen behind her lit up. Thaddeus's stomach dropped. Slide 1, a wire transfer dated October 15, 2020. $50 million from Atlas Partners, LLC to Sterling Tech operating account. Clean, professional, devastating in its simplicity. 5 years ago, Sterling Tech was 72 hours from bankruptcy. The Series A funding had collapsed, payroll was coming due, and the company Mr. Sterling founded was on the verge of dissolution. Then a venture fund called Atlas Partners provided emergency Series B capital. $50 million, founder-friendly terms, minimal due diligence. Mr. Sterling has often cited this as validation of his vision, proof that merit and talent matter more than connections. Eva's eyes found his across the room. No anger there, just terrible clarity. Atlas Partners is a shell company. The ultimate beneficial owner is Hartwell Capital, the firm my father has operated for 40 years, which means the foundation of Sterling Tech's success, the capital that enabled every subsequent round of funding, and the eventual IPO came from my family. Not because venture capitalists recognized Mr. Sterling's genius, but because I asked my father not to let my husband's dream die. Murmurs rippled through the room. Phones appeared, fingers typing notes. The Bloomberg camera swiveled to capture Thaddeus's reaction. He kept his face neutral through sheer force of will, even as something inside him curled up and died. Slide 2, a series of personal transactions from 2019 and 2020. Eva's sales of jewelry art items from her trust that Thaddeus had assumed were hers to do with as she pleased, never questioning the timing or amounts. During that same period, I liquidated personal assets to cover Sterling Tech's operational shortfalls, $45,000 to make October payroll when cash flow couldn't cover it, $38,000 for office rent when the landlord threatened eviction, $120,000 from my personal trust to hire the engineering team that built the product which eventually became our flagship offering. She clicked through receipts, each one time-stamped, and notarized proof beyond argument. Thaddeus watched his mythology dissolve line by line. Mr. Sterling has characterized his success as self-made. That narrative appears in his public statements, his interviews, his SEC filings. He's told shareholders and the press that he built Sterling Tech alone through talent and determination, with no help beyond what merit earned him. The next slide appeared transcript from his IPO speech, his own words magnified on a screen 12 feet high. I want to thank everyone who believed in me when I had nothing. This company exists because I refused to quit, because I proved that vision matters more than pedigree, that code matters more than connections. Sterling Tech is proof that in America, you can still build an empire from zero if you're willing to work harder than everyone else. Eva let that hang in the air, his hubris preserved in archived video. Then she spoke, her voice steady as surgical steel. Zero. That was the word he used. But zero isn't $50 million from my father's fund. Zero isn't the $120,000 I withdrew from my trust to pay his employees. Zero isn't the nights I spent editing pitch decks while he slept, or the meetings I attended in his place when stress made him physically ill, or the conversations I had with investors to reassure them when code delays threatened to sink the Series C. She paused, hand moving unconsciously to the car seat beside the podium where Nathaniel stirred but didn't wake. I don't say this to diminish Mr. Sterling's contributions. The vision was real. The coding was brilliant. The execution created genuine value. But value built on hidden subsidies while claiming self-sufficiency isn't just dishonest. It's a betrayal of everyone who actually started from zero and didn't have a spouse quietly covering the gaps. Thaddeus felt eyes turning toward him, journalists calculating angles, shareholders reassessing risk. He wanted to stand to object, to explain that he hadn't known about Atlas Partners, hadn't understood the full scope of Eva's sacrifices. But the knowing didn't matter anymore. He'd benefited from help while denying it existed, and that made him either a liar or a fool, possibly both. Slide 3 showed Sterling Tech's IPO event at the Plaza. Video began playing Thaddeus on stage, confident and polished, thanking investors and advisors and the team that built something extraordinary. The camera panned across the audience, found Eva at a back table in a black gown, face carefully neutral. Then her expression cracked just for a moment before she stood and left. Mid-speech, her exit captured by a photographer who'd probably been shooting crowd reactions. This was taken February 2023, the day Sterling Tech went public. Mr. Sterling spoke for 18 minutes about the journey from startup to IPO. He thanked 47 people by name, investors, advisors, engineers, his Stanford mentor who'd encouraged him to pursue entrepreneurship. Eva's voice didn't rise, didn't need to. He didn't mention me, not once, not even in passing. Not even the generic "and my wife" for her support that most CEOs include out of basic decency. And when I realized he was going to speak for 20 minutes without acknowledging that I existed, I left. Because sitting there watching him erase me from his own origin story, I finally understood I wasn't a partner. I was infrastructure he'd learned to take for granted. The room was absolutely silent now. Even the journalists had stopped typing. Slide 4 appeared, the divorce filing, certain sections highlighted in yellow. The paternity test request specifically rendered large enough that everyone could read the clinical language requesting court-ordered genetic verification. 3 weeks ago, Mr. Sterling filed for divorce. That's his right, and I don't contest it. But he included this clause requesting paternity verification for our son. In legal filings that became public record, he formally questioned whether the child I was carrying was his. He did this knowing I've never been alone with another man during our marriage. knowing that his own security team could account for my whereabouts every day, knowing that the accusation would leak to press and destroy my reputation while he positioned himself as the rational party protecting his interests. She pulled out another document, held it up. This is the paternity test result expedited per his request. 99.97% probability that Thaddeus Sterling is Nathaniel's biological father, which he would have known without court intervention if he'd bothered to trust the woman who'd spent 8 years making his dreams possible. Eva set down the paper, gripped the podium edges like they were the only solid things in a tilting world. But the worst part wasn't the accusation. It was the timing. I went into emergency labor on October 22nd, 7 weeks early due to preeclampsia. The hospital called Mr. Sterling at 6:47 p.m. to inform him I was being rushed into surgery. He was at a gala at the plaza that night with Sterling Tech's CFO celebrating his new freedom. He saw the call, and he declined to answer. Gasps, audible and genuine. Thaddeus closed his eyes, unable to watch, but unable to leave. I delivered Nathaniel alone, had a cesarean alone, woke up from anesthesia alone. And when the hospital finally reached my father instead, when Cornelius Hartwell arrived at Mount Sinai at 11 p.m. to meet his grandson, the first thing he asked was whether my husband knew. I told him yes. Mr. Sterling had been informed and chosen not to come. She picked up Nathaniel's car seat, lifted it slightly so the cameras could see the sleeping infant. This is the child he questioned was his, the son he couldn't be bothered to meet on the day of his birth, the baby who's 3 weeks old and hasn't been held by his father once. Thaddeus felt something break in his chest, hot and sharp. Around him, shareholders shifted in their seats. A woman in the front row was crying openly. Eva set the car seat down gently, and for just a moment her composure cracked. She looked directly at the sleeping infant, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a mother's fierceness that had nothing to do with boardrooms or balance sheets. In 2020, I lost our first child. A miscarriage at 14 weeks while Mr. Sterling was in Silicon Valley pitching investors. I called him from the emergency room at Mount Sinai, the same hospital where I'd deliver Nathaniel 3 years later. He said he'd catch the next flight. He didn't. The pitch meeting ran long. Then there was a dinner he couldn't miss. Then his flight got delayed. He came home 36 hours later and asked if I was feeling better, like I'd had the flu. The detail landed like a punch. Several people in the audience looked physically ill. I didn't tell anyone else about that loss because he asked me not to. He said it would make investors nervous about his focus, that we should keep personal tragedies private until Sterling Tech was more stable. So I carried that grief alone while he built a company on capital my father provided and sacrifices I made invisible. She straightened, pulled herself back to professional mode, but the emotional weight remained. Now, let's discuss why this matters to you as investors. New slide. Sterling Tech's debt structure color-coded by holder. Sterling Tech currently carries $340 million in debt notes due in 2026. These notes were issued during our last acquisition to finance the purchase and integration costs. 51% of this debt is held by an entity called Sentinel Holdings. Sentinel is a Hartwell Capital subsidiary. She let that sink in, watched comprehension dawn across faces. Which means if I wanted to, I could call this debt immediately. Sterling Tech would have 90 days to repay $173 million or face bankruptcy proceedings. Your equity, your positions, your investments would be subordinated to debt holders in liquidation. You would lose everything. Panic flickered across the room like lightning. Patricia Jo was already on her phone. Mitchell Raines had gone pale. But I'm not going to do that. Eva's voice cut through rising noise. Not because I'm merciful, but because Sterling Tech employs 3,400 people who don't deserve to lose their jobs because of one man's failures. Because there's genuine value in this company, value created by engineers and designers and support staff who believed in the mission. Because destroying Sterling Tech to punish Thaddeus Sterling would make me just as selfish as he's been. The relief was palpable, visible in loosening shoulders and resumed breathing. However, her hands came together, fingers interlacing. Mr. Sterling has demonstrated catastrophic failures in judgment. He built a company on capital he didn't disclose. He accepted sacrifices he never acknowledged. He made personal decisions: infidelity, public humiliation of his spouse, abandonment of his newborn child that directly impacted shareholder confidence and stock valuation. He suspended the CFO who'd been enabling his blind spots, but only after she'd already positioned herself to profit from his downfall. And through all of it, he's maintained that he alone deserves credit for success while externalizing blame for any failures. She pulled out a final document, held it up. This is a governance proposal drafted by Hartwell Capital in consultation with 3 independent board members. It calls for Mr. Sterling's resignation as CEO, his transition to an advisory role with no operational authority, and the appointment of an external CEO with experience scaling technology companies through periods of transition. It calls for a comprehensive audit of executive decision-making over the past 18 months, and it calls for restructuring the board to include 2 seats appointed by Hartwell Capital, given our position as majority voting stakeholder. Eva looked directly at Thaddeus for the first time since the presentation began. I don't want to destroy what you built, Thaddeus. I want to save it from you. And I want our son to grow up knowing his father became someone worth respecting, even if it took losing everything to get there. Then she gathered her notes, picked up Nathaniel's car seat with a tenderness that contrasted sharply with the devastation she'd just delivered, and walked off the stage without waiting for questions. The room erupted. Journalists shouting inquiries, shareholders demanding clarification, board members huddling in urgent conference. But Eva was already gone, disappeared through a side exit with Maria running interference, leaving behind wreckage so thorough it would take months to assess the full damage. Thaddeus sat frozen in his third-row seat watching his empire dissolve in real time. Phones were out everywhere, the presentation already spreading across financial media, Twitter lighting up with takes and hot opinions, and the particular schadenfreude of watching powerful men face consequences. His own phone started buzzing call after call from numbers he didn't recognize. He turned it off, sat in the noise and chaos, and felt strangely calm. This was what accountability looked like. This was what happened when you built a life on lies and someone finally turned on the lights. The crowd began dispersing after 20 minutes, shareholders filing out in tight clusters of urgent conversation, journalists racing to file stories, board members retreating to closed-door sessions. Thaddeus remained seated until the room was nearly empty, until only a few stragglers remained, and the Bloomberg crew was packing up equipment. Mr. Sterling, a voice, female professional. He looked up to find a woman in her 40s, press credentials hanging from her neck. Rebecca Cortez, Wall Street Journal. Do you have a moment? He should say no. Should call Sterling Tech's PR team. Get coached on message discipline, deliver carefully crafted statements that protected whatever remained of his image. Instead, he heard himself say, yes. She sat down beside him, recorder visible but not intrusive. I'm writing a piece on today's shareholder meeting and I wanted to give you an opportunity to comment. Everything your ex-wife said, is it accurate? Thaddeus looked at the empty stage where Eva had stood, where she'd dismantled him with nothing but truth and documentation. He thought about all the ways he could spin this minimized damage, reframe the narrative. Then he thought about Nathaniel, about the kind of man he wanted his son's father to be. Yes. The word came out steady, certain. Everything she said was accurate. I built a company on my wife's money while claiming I did it alone. I accepted her sacrifices without acknowledgement. When she became inconvenient, I divorced her. When that wasn't enough humiliation, I questioned whether my own son was mine. And when she went into emergency labor, I saw the hospital's call and decided a networking event mattered more. Rebecca's pen moved rapidly across her notepad. So, you're admitting everything Ms. Hartwell alleged. I'm admitting I've been a terrible husband and a worse man. The company my ex-wife wants to save. She's right. It needs saving from me. I'm the liability, not the asset. Are you prepared to step down as CEO? Thaddeus looked down at his hands, saw them shaking slightly. He pressed them flat against his thighs until the trembling stopped. Yes. I'm resigning effective immediately. Sterling Tech deserves leadership that puts the company ahead of ego. And my son deserves a father who'll show up even when it's uncomfortable, especially then. The words once spoken felt like stepping off a cliff into air that might hold him or might not. But at least he was finally telling the truth. "What will you do now?" Rebecca's question was gentler than he deserved. "I have no idea. For the first time in 15 years, I don't have a plan. And maybe that's exactly what I need." He stood, nodded to her, and walked out of the conference hall into afternoon sunlight that felt too bright, too honest. His phone, still powered off, sat heavy in his pocket. When he turned it back on, notifications would flood in: emails from board members, texts from former allies distancing themselves, voicemails from reporters wanting follow-ups. But there would also be, he hoped, one message that mattered more than all the others combined. The penthouse felt like a museum dedicated to someone else's life. Thaddeus walked through rooms where Eva's absence created negative space furniture arranged around ghosts of conversations they'd never had, moments they'd never shared. He found himself in what should have been the nursery, the room they'd started decorating before the divorce. Paint samples still taped to the wall. Eva had wanted soft gray, he'd lobbied for white because it was cleaner, more modern. They'd never finished the argument. The room sat empty except for one item, a rocking chair, antique oak, sitting by the window overlooking Central Park. He didn't remember it arriving. Sat down, carefully tested, the runners felt the chair rock with a rhythm designed to soothe crying infants and exhausted parents. On the seat cushion, a note in Eva's handwriting. The paper slightly yellowed, like it had been sitting here for days waiting to be found. "This was my mother's. She used it for me. I ordered it delivered here because I thought we'd use it together. You can keep it or donate it, your choice. But I wanted you to know I'd imagined us here taking turns at 3 a.m. learning how to be parents. That was real for me, even if it wasn't for you." Thaddeus pressed the note to his chest, rocked slowly, and let himself imagine what might have been if he'd been paying attention. Eva in this chair, Nathaniel against her shoulder, him bringing her water and asking how he could help. The two of them exhausted and terrified, and together building something that mattered more than market cap or media coverage or any metric he'd spent 8 years optimizing. He'd traded that possibility for what a company he was about to lose anyway. A relationship with Isabeau that had evaporated the moment she couldn't profit from it. A reputation in ruins, and a son who didn't know his face. His phone buzzed. He'd turned it back on during the drive home, had been ignoring the flood of notifications. But this one from Gideon Alcott made him stop. Subject line, "From E.H." He opened it, found a photo. Nathaniel awake, eyes open, staring at something beyond the frame with an expression of profound seriousness. Thaddeus zoomed in, saw his own features reflected in miniature, the deep-set eyes, the stubborn chin, the way one eyebrow lifted slightly higher than the other when assessing something new. Below the photo, Thaddeus. "You can meet him. Saturday, 10 a.m., my father's house in Bridgehampton. Supervised visit, 2 hours maximum. Don't bring gifts or make promises you won't keep. Just show up. That's all I'm asking. If you can't commit to that, tell me now. Nathaniel deserves consistency more than he deserves a father who appears when it's convenient." Saturday was 2 days away. 48 hours to figure out what he'd say to a son who couldn't understand words yet, but would somehow know the way babies did, whether his father was someone worth trusting. Thaddeus looked around the empty nursery at the paint samples and the rocking chair and all the plans they'd made that he'd destroyed through neglect and arrogance. Then he typed a response, "I'll be there, 10 a.m., no gifts, no excuses. Just me trying to be someone who deserves a second chance I probably don't deserve. Thank you for this. I know you didn't have to." He hit send before he could second-guess the words, then saved Nathaniel's photo as his phone background, replacing the Sterling Tech logo that had occupied that space for 5 years. The emails and voicemails could wait. The board votes and restructuring and inevitable lawsuits could all unfold without his input. For the first time since Eva had left Thaddeus, Sterling was going to stop controlling the narrative and start accepting reality. He sat in that rocking chair as afternoon light died over Central Park, Manhattan's skyline, blazing gold and amber in the sunset, and felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Not peace exactly, not forgiveness, he hadn't earned that and might never, but possibility. The chance to build something that mattered more than empire. a relationship with his son. Maybe eventually enough integrity that when Nathaniel was old enough to Google his father's name, he'd find evidence of change alongside evidence of failure. The city outside kept spinning 8 million people pursuing their own ambitions and making their own mistakes. Somewhere in that vast grid of light and noise, Eva was putting Nathaniel to bed, singing lullabies, or reading board books, or doing whatever new mothers did when the world went quiet. He wasn't part of that world yet, might never be fully welcomed back. But Saturday at 10 a.m. he'd start the work of earning his way in, not as the CEO who'd built an empire, but as a father who'd finally learned that showing up mattered more than success. Thaddeus stood, folded Eva's note carefully, placed it in his wallet next to a photo of them from their wedding day. Then he made 2 calls. The first to a therapist Gideon had recommended months ago when the divorce was fresh, and Thaddeus had been too proud to admit he needed help. He left a message asking for the earliest available appointment. The second to his mother in Sunset Park, the call he should have made weeks ago. "Ma," his voice cracked, "I need to come see you. There's a lot I need to tell you and someone I want you to meet. His name is Nathaniel. He's your grandson." On the other end of the line, his mother was crying, but her voice, when she finally spoke, carried nothing but love. "Come home, mijo. We'll figure it out together." Home. The word felt foreign and essential, like something he'd spent 15 years running from and suddenly needed more than air. Thaddeus ended the call, looked around the penthouse one last time at the view that had cost millions, the furniture that had impressed investors, the empty rooms that proved wealth without warmth was just another kind of poverty. Then he grabbed his keys and drove to Brooklyn to a rent-controlled apartment where family waited, where his mother would hold him while he explained everything he'd broken, where the work of becoming someone worth respecting could finally begin. Not because he'd lost his company, not because Eva had destroyed his reputation, not even because the Wall Street Journal was about to publish an interview that would define him as a cautionary tale, but because somewhere in Bridgehampton a 3-week-old boy was waiting to meet his father, and that Thaddeus finally understood mattered more than every empire he could ever build. The city lights blurred past his windows as he drove, Manhattan receding in the rearview mirror. Ahead, Brooklyn. Home. The place where stories ended, and if you were lucky enough and worked hard enough and became honest enough, where they sometimes began again.